Thurgood Marshall, July 2nd, 1908 to January 24th, 1993. Was an American civil rights lawyer and a jurist who served as an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States from 1967 until 1991. He was the Supreme Court's first African American justice. Prior to his judicial service, he was an attorney who fought for civil rights, leading the NAACP, Legal Defense and Education Fund. Marshall was a prominent figure in the movement to end racial segregation in schools. He won 29 of the 32 civil rights cases he argued before the Supreme Court, culminating in the court's landmark 1954 decision, Brown versus the Board of Education, which rejected the separate but equal doctrine. He held segregation in public education to be unconstitutional. President Lyndon B. Johnson appointed Marshall to be Supreme Court Justice in 1967. A staunch liberal, he frequently dissented as the court became increasingly conservative. His early life in education. Thurgood Marshall was born on July 2nd, 1908 in Baltimore, Maryland, to Norma and William Canfield. His father held various jobs as a waiter in hotels and clubs and on a railroad car. And his mother was a school teacher. The family moved to New York City in search of better employment opportunities not long after Thurgood's birth. They returned to Baltimore when he was 6 years old. He was an energetic and boisterous child who frequently found himself in trouble. Following legal cases was one of William's hobbies, and Thurgood oftentimes went to court with him to observe the proceedings. Marshall later said that his father never told me to become a lawyer, but he turned me into one. He taught me how to argue, challenged my logic on every point by making me prove every statement I made, even if we were discussing the weather. His legal career. Marshall started a law practice in Baltimore, but it was not financially successful, partially because he spent much of his time working for the benefit of the community. He volunteered with the Baltimore branch of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, in 1935. Marshall and Houston brought suit against the University of Maryland on behalf of Donald Gaines Murray, an African American whose application to the University Law School had been rejected on account of his race. In that case, Murray v. Pearson, Judge Eugene O'Doon ordered that Murray be admitted, and the Maryland Court of Appeals affirmed, holding that it violated equal protection to admit white students to the law school while keeping blacks from being educated in state. The decision was never appealed to the Supreme Court of the United States and therefore did not apply nationwide, but it pleased Marshall, who later said that he had filed a lawsuit to get even with the bastards who had kept him from attending school himself. Court of Appeals. President John F. Kennedy, who according to Chestnut wanted to demonstrate his commitment to the interests of African Americans without incurring enormous political costs, nominated Marshall to be judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit on September 23, 1961. The Second Circuit, which spanned New York, Vermont, Connecticut, was at the time the nation's prominent appellate court. When Congress adjourned, Kennedy gave Marshall a recess appointment, and he took the oath of office on October 23, 1961. Solicitor General. When Archibald Cox resigned, President Lyndon B. Johnson nominated Marshall to take his place as Solicitor General. The individual responsible for arguing before the Supreme Court on behalf of the federal government. The nomination was widely viewed as a stepping stone to the Supreme Court appointment. Johnson pressured Southern senators not to obstruct Marshall's confirmation, and a hearing before the Senate subcommittee lasted only 15 minutes. The full Senate confirmed him on August 11, 1965, as Solicitor General. Marshall won 14 of the 19 Supreme Court cases he argued. He later characterized the position as the most effective job and maybe the best job he's ever had, Marshall argued. In Harper v. Virginia State Board of Elections, 1966, that conditioning the ability to vote on the payment of a poll tax was unlawful. In a companion case to the Miranda v. Arizona 1966, he successfully maintained on behalf of the government that federal agents were not always required to inform arrested individuals of their rights. He defended the constitutionality of the Voting Rights Acts of 1965 in South Carolina. Supreme Court nomination. In February 1967, Lyndon B. Johnson nominated Ramsey Clark to be Attorney General. The nominee's father was Tom C. Clark, an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. Fearing that his son's appointment would create substantial conflicts of interest for him, the elder Clark announced his resignation from the court for Johnson, who had long desired to nominate a non-white justice. The choice of nominee to fill the ensuing vacancy was as easy as it was obvious, according to the scholar Henry J. Abraham. Although the president briefly considered selecting William H. Haste, an African-American appellate judge from Philadelphia, or a female candidate, he decided to choose Marshall. Johnson announced the nomination in the White House Rose Garden on June 13th, declaring that Marshall deserves the appointment. I believe that it is the right thing to do, the right time to do it, the right man in the right place. Supreme Court. Marshall remained on the Supreme Court for nearly 24 years, serving until his retirement in 1991. The court to which he was appointed, the Warren Court, had a consistent liberal majority, and Marshall's jurisprudence was similar to that of its leaders, Chief Justice Warren and Justice William J. Brennan, Jr. Although he wrote a few major opinions during this period due to his lack of seniority, he was typically in the majority. As a result of 4 Supreme Court appointments by President Richard Nixon, however, the Liberal coalition vanished the court under Chief Justice Warren Burger. The Burger Court was not as conservative as some observers had anticipated, but the task of constructing liberal majorities case by case was left primarily to Brennan. Marshall's most consequential contribution to the constitutional law came in dissent. The justice left much of his work to his law clerks, preferring to determine the outcome of the case and then allow the clerks to draft the opinions themselves. He took umbrage at frequent claims that he did no work and spent his time watching daytime soap operas. According to Tushnet, who clerked for Marshall, the ideas that he was a lazy justice, uninterested in court's work, is wrong and perhaps racist. Marshall's closest colleagues and friends on the court was Brennan, and 2 justices agreed so often that their clerks privately referred to them as Justice Brennan Marshall. He also had a high regard for Warren, whom he described as probably the greatest Chief Justice who ever lived. His personal life. Marshall wed Vivian Westerbury on September 4th, 1929. While he was a student at Lincoln University, they remained married until her death from cancer in 1955. Marshall married Cecilia Sissy Suyet, an NAACP secretary. 11 months later, They had two children, Thurgood Jr. and John. Thurgood Jr. became an attorney and worked in the Clinton administration, and John directed the U.S. Marshal Service and served as Virginia's Secretary of Public Safety. Retirement and later life and death. Marshall did not wish to retire. He frequently said, "I was opposed to a life term. I intend to serve it," but he had been in ill health for many years. Brennan's retirement in 1990 left him unhappy and isolated on the court. The 82-year-old justice announced on June 27, 1991 that he would retire. When asked at a press conference what's wrong with him that would cause him to leave the court, he replied, "What's wrong with me? I'm old, I'm getting old, I'm coming apart." Appraisal and legacy. According to scholars, according to the scholar Daniel Moak, Marshall profoundly shaped the political direction of the United States, transformed constitutional law, and opened up a new facet of citizenship to Black Americans. For Tishnet, he was probably the most important American lawyer of the 20th century. In the view of political scientist Robert C. Smith, he was one of the greatest leaders in the history of African American struggle for freedom and equality. A 1999 survey of Black political scientists listed Marshall as one of the 10 greatest African American leaders in history. Panelists described him as the greatest juror of the 20th century and stated that he spearheaded the creation of the legal foundations of civil rights. Thurgood Marshall, Parts of People.